Hello again and happy Saturday, still from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. This video's topic is to examine the political and governmental systems of Iran, known until the 1920s, if I remember correctly, or 1930s as Persia. Iran is a large country in Western Asia. It has hundreds of kilometers of coastline in the south on the Persian Gulf, in the north, a shorter coastline on the southern shores of the Caspian Sea. Its western executed dictator, Saddam Hussein, is Iraq. But then in the east, its neighbors include Afghanistan and Pakistan. Iran has, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, been one of the world's four countries that call themselves Islamic republics. Mauritania in Western Africa is another such country. It is at the same time a semi-theocratic state and a presidential state. So in practice, this means that Iran has two heads of state. The Muslim supreme leader, who is elected indirectly by a group of leading Iranian Muslim clergymen, is in practice the more important of the two because he serves for the rest of his life, unless then either he decides to resign or he becomes too ill to carry out his duties. Since the death of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1989, Ali Khamenei has been the supreme Muslim leader of Iran. The second and in practice less important head of state of Iran is the president, who is elected directly by the Iranian voters for a 4-year term and is eligible to serve 2 consecutive terms. The current Iranian president is Mr. Hassan Rouhani, who is due to retire in 2021, having served his 2 constitutionally allotted terms. Although Iran is officially a presidential republic, in other words, the president serves as the second head of state and as the head of government, curiously enough, the Iranian cabinet has to be formally approved by a majority vote in the Majlis, which is the Iranian parliament. Although Iran has several registered political parties, generally speaking, we can say, or if we want to short form and simplify the Iranian party system, we can state the following. None of the parties can be officially secular or non-religious. So already from that fact, we can infer correctly that Iran violates one of the key principles of Western democracy. In other words, that church or state, or more generally, religion and state, should be kept separate in the sense that there should be no official religious test for public office. That the people who either have a religion other than the majority or biggest religion, or no religion at all, are just as free to be candidates for public offices, whether elected ones like those of the president or members of parliament, or for the appointed ones, the civil service positions, as are those people who belong to either the majority religious group or other religious communities. So generally speaking, we can say that there are only 3 types of parties in political parties in Iran, and now I'm talking of the registered political parties. The first are those who are so-called principlists, who want to strictly adhere both to the letter and to the spirit of the Islamic Republic's constitution and political system. The second group consists of the parties which are willing to make some practical adjustments, or are somewhat more moderate in their applications of the Islamic Republic's principles to the daily reality of politics, and who are willing to seek accommodation, including certain economic and other deals, even with the secular Western democracies, as long as they are on fairly good terms or want to be on fairly good terms with Iran. And then the third major group of the registered political parties are formed by the official religious minorities, such as the Christians and the Jews. 5 of the 290 members of the Majlis belong to these religious minorities. The other 285 are filled by the various Muslim parties' representatives. In the 2020 parliamentary elections, whose first round was held in February, and then the second round, badly postponed by the COVID-19 outbreak, was only held in September, the reform-minded and moderate parties lost over 100 seats to the benefit of the hardline parties, which then once again set back the prospects for any real democratization of Iran's political system, at least until 2024, barring some kind of popular revolt. At times, there have been signs of unrest. There were, for example, protests where a number of the demonstrators were killed or wounded in 2009 at the re-election of then-President Ahmadinejad, known for his violent anti-Israel rhetoric. The truly hardline Iranian Muslims, or at least those who sometimes get publicity, are known for their violent anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally speaking, anti-Western rhetoric. Then there are those who are more moderate ones, such as the former President Mohammad Khatami, who was in office from 1997 to 2005, incidentally just before the hardliner Ahmadinejad was elected. And then Rouhani seems to be somewhat of moderate. Actually, during his first presidential term, the so-called nuclear deal was signed by the United States and Iran. But President Trump has voided that. I'm not sure if the incoming President-elect Biden wants to revive the nuclear deal. Iran, therefore, is only nominally and in a limited sense a democracy, because it doesn't allow the secular groups or individuals to organize themselves into officially registered political parties, and the officially openly secular people are not allowed to hold any public office. Likewise, the Sharia law, the Islamic law, which is to some extent in practice in at least most of the Muslim states, most of the tens of the countries in the world where Islam is the majority religion or the largest religious group. In Iran, it's quite strictly applied, which of course automatically means that certain groups of people, such as those who are openly critical of Islam or even openly hostile towards it, and then people who have sexual orientations other than the heterosexual one, are automatically at a disadvantage. Also are those people who are deeply religious, but whose religions are other religions than Islam, and who seek to convert, or as the saying goes among the Muslim critics, many Muslim critics of such efforts, proselytize Muslims. That kind of activity is forbidden by law in Iran. Yet there are small groups of Christians and other non-Muslims who do try to convert Iranian Muslims, even at the risk of death or imprisonment or torture or expulsion or deportation from the country. Iran wasn't always a hardline Muslim country. Ironically, during the long reign of its last Shah, meaning king and since 1966 emperor, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was a Muslim, as are a great majority of the Iranians, but who was a notably liberal and Western oriented Muslim, notorious for his womanizing. He was married 3 times. His last wife, the former Empress Farah Diba, is still alive. She's already in her early 80s. The Shah died uh, of cancer of the spleen or pancreas in July 1980, 1.5 years after months of ongoing protests against him had forced him effectively to abdicate or resign and leave Iran in January 1979. And he had then spent time in several countries. The first country where he had flown had been Egypt, whose authoritarian president and dictator, Mr. Anwar el Sadat, a personal friend of the Shah or deposed Shah, openly welcomed him. At last, he was operated on in late 1979 in the United States, but that came too late. It only, to some extent, prolonged his painful life, painful earthly life. So there you have it, and I think that I can already go to the presentation of the Freedom House's report after this short introduction. Well, I mean, yeah, I should say also that there is the Guardian Council, or the Council of Guardians, half of whose members are experts of the of the Muslim law, Sharia. The other half, for some reason, maybe to give the Sharia laws experts some advice on how to practically reconcile secular laws with religious ones. They are experts in secular or ordinary law. So the Council of Guardians checks every single law passed by the Majlis to ensure that it is in accordance with the Sharia law and the Islamic Republic's constitution. And there's also an electoral body, if I remember correctly, that screens all of the candidates for elective public office, including the presidential and parliamentary ones. And each time there is a presidential election or a parliamentary election, for example, a minority of the candidates are rejected because they are determined to be not sufficiently in favor of the Islamic Republic's principles or to be actually against those principles. So there is truly a religious test for public office. And even the 5 religious minority members of the Majlis have to affirm their support of the Islamic Republic's principles, or at least of its constitution, which recognizes Sunni Islam, if I remember correctly, as the state religion. Well, I have to check that. Check that. Yes, the Assembly of Experts is the group or institution of high-ranking Iranian Muslim clerics. Okay, Shiites, so it's the Shiite Islam which is the state religion. And the Assembly of Experts then chooses the supreme leader of Iranian Muslims for the rest of his lifetime, barring a resignation or determination that because of ill health he no longer can exercise his office. Yes, the Assembly of Experts has the power to remove the leader from office if they find that he is unable to execute his duties. So, I'm trying to find the correct one. Yes. So, predictably, Freedom House found in 2019 that Iran only got a score of 17 points out of 100 and therefore was classified as not free country. Only 7 out of 40 points in political rights and 10 out of 60 points in civil liberties. The Islamic Republic of Iran holds elections regularly. Yes, presidential and parliamentary ones, and then lower level ones like provincial and municipal ones. However, since there is that religious test, there is an electoral body composed of experts of the Iranian constitution, and that body determines whether the candidates adhere sufficiently sincerely or sufficiently fully to the principles of the Islamic Republic's constitution to be considered acceptable candidates. So there is a religious test for public office. Ultimate power rests in the hands of the country's Muslim supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the unelected institutions under his control. These institutions, including the security forces and the judiciary or courts, play a major role in the suppression of dissent, in other words, disagreeing with the official ideology, and other restrictions on civil liberties. And there is, in practice, great difficulty to find purely secular courts in Iran, because even if there are any secular courts, even they have to accept the Islamic Republic's principles. So Iran is a really tough country for the truly secular people to live in, even if they were foreign born. In which case, some leniency is shown to them, but they have to be careful not to criticize the system, even on social media, or they will find themselves in trouble. Key developments in 2019. Protesters took to the streets in about 100 cities and towns in mid-November 2019, following the announcement of a significant hike in the price of gasoline. Security forces responded with lethal violence, while Iran, being a semi-theocratic and authoritarian dictatorship that is acceptable in the state authorities' opinion. Unacceptable, of course, and rightly so, in the human rights organization's opinion. Reportedly killing over 300 people, injuring thousands, and arresting thousands more. Authorities implemented a near-total internet shutdown that lasted for nearly a week, in an apparent bid to suppress information about the protests and related state violence. Earlier in 2019, the courts imposed a series of heavy prison sentences on labor activists, human rights lawyers, and women protesting the country's compulsory hijab or the head cover rules, among others. Head and facial covering rules. Hardline cleric Ebrahim Raisi, who allegedly played a role in mass executions of political prisoners in the 1980s, for most of that decade, Iran was locked in an ultimately stalemated war with its western neighbor Iraq, whose then dictator Saddam Hussein started it in order to be able to conquer the oil-rich province of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran, but he failed. And then certain Western countries like the United States opportunistically supplied at times Iraq and at times Iran with weapons. One of the sad culminations, even shameful culminations of this wheeling and dealing was the so-called Iran-Contra scandal, which involved weapons sales to Iran, and then with the proceeds, the United States federal government, led by then President Ronald Reagan, then funded the right-wing Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua, a Central American country, fighting the left-wing Sandinista government of President Daniel Ortega, who incidentally is still in power, although he hasn't been in power continuously. So Mr. Raisi was appointed as chief of the judiciary in March 2019. Iran, which, like China and a number of other dictatorships, and North Korea, of course, and Saudi Arabia, executes people every year. We don't know exactly how many. There may be hundreds, there may even be thousands. And because these countries are strict dictatorships, we can only estimate. But definitely more than just a few. And they are definitely not like last resort executions. But since Sharia is applied, Iran executes people, well, for example, for adultery and homosexuality and idolatry and so forth, apostasy from Islam. And sometimes even the traditional and truly bloody form of execution of beheading by the sword is used, like in Saudi Arabia. So the state of Iran reportedly executed close to 300 people over the course of 2019, including at least 2 juvenile offenders who were put to death in April. So the supreme leader has no fixed term, and he is the highest authority in the country. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and appoints the head of the judiciary, the heads of state broadcast media, and the Expediency Council, a body tasked with mediating disputes between the Guardian Council and the parliament, or Majlis. The supreme leader also appoints 6 members of the Guardian Council. The other 6 are jurists or legal experts nominated by the head of the judiciary and confirmed by the Majlis, all for 6-year terms. The supreme leader is appointed by the Assembly of Experts, and they monitor his work. However, in practice, his decisions appear to go unchallenged by the Assembly, whose proceedings are not made public. So the president can serve only a maximum of 2 terms or 8 years, usually consecutively. So far, none of the elected presidents has been defeated in his bid for re-election. In the 2017 presidential elections, only 6 men were allowed to run out of some 1,600 candidates who had applied. There were also 137 female candidates, all of whom were disqualified by the Guardian Council. The main challenger to incumbent President Mr. Hassan Rouhani, a self-proclaimed moderate, was hardline cleric Ebrahim Raisi. Rouhani was re-elected with 57% of the vote, and about 70% of the eligible Iranian voters turned out to vote. In the run-up to that election, the authorities intensified their crackdown on the media, arresting several journalists and administrators of reformist channels on Telegram, the popular messaging application in Iran. So the Majlis members serve 4 years. There are 290 of them. In 2016, elections were held for both the Parliament and the Assembly of Experts, a body of 86 clerics who are elected to 8-year terms by popular vote. Only 51% of the candidates who had applied to run for the Majlis were approved by the Guardian Council, the lowest figure to date. I don't know what the figure was 2000. Also, for the Assembly of Experts, also record low. At the end of the process, relatively moderate Rouhani supporters held over 40% of seats in the parliament. They hold significantly lower percentage now, unfortunately, while independents, who included a number of reformists and hardliners, each took about a third. In December 2019, ahead of the first round of parliamentary elections scheduled for February 2020, a number of reformist candidates were reportedly disqualified from running. So, probably as a prelude to their rather massive defeat, and one of the reasons for it. Obviously, the electoral system in Iran does not meet international democratic standards, because the Guardian Council, that is controlled by hardline conservative Muslims and ultimately by the supreme leader, checks the adherence of all candidates for parliament, the presidency, and the assembly of experts for their degree of allegiance to the Islamic Republic. So typically the council rejects candidates who are not considered insiders or deemed fully loyal to the clerical establishment, as well as women seeking to run in the presidential elections. So Iran is not only a strictly Muslim country, but also strictly a patriarchal or male-led and dominated country. As a result, Iranian voters are given a limited choice of candidates. The formation of political parties and groups is not free. It is bound to the majority religion, Islam. Reformist groups have come under increased state repression, especially since 2009, and affiliated politicians are subject to arbitrary detention and imprisonment on vague criminal charges. While there is some space for shifts in power between approved factions within the establishment, the unelected components of the constitutional system represent a permanent barrier to opposition electoral victories and genuine rotations of power, barring, of course, some radical change, such as a popular uprising. But then that would require a significant number and percentage of the Iranian police officers and soldiers, for example, to rise up against the hardline Muslim establishment there, which is, at least at this point, unfortunately unlikely. In 2015, two new reformist parties, Nedaya Iranian, or Voice of Iranians, and Ettehad Mellat Iran, Iranian National Unity, were established to run candidates in the 2016 parliamentary elections. However, most candidates from these two parties and other reformist groups were disqualified by the Guardian Council ahead of the voting. So apparently the Guardian Council is dominated by people who are somewhat afraid of any significant reform movements springing up, even if these parties were only formed, let's say, a year before the parliamentary elections, and probably were unlikely to get anything close to a majority. Or even if they were unlikely, or any single one of them was unlikely to become even the second largest group or party in the Iranian parliament, still many of their candidates can be disqualified. So it's a kind of preemptive strike against any significant attempts to reform the Iranian political system. Top opposition leaders in Iran face, predictably, restrictions on their movement and access to the media. Well, how could it be otherwise? Mir Hossein Musabi, Zahra Rahnavard, and Mehdi Karoubi, leaders of the reformist Green movement, whose protests were violently suppressed after the disputed 2009 presidential elections, have been under house arrest without formal charges since 2011. Reformist former President Mohammad Khatami is the subject of a media ban that prohibits the press from even mentioning him, and publishing his photographs. Interestingly enough, former hardline President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who fell out of favor for challenging Khamenei, so which means that even the hardline Iranian Muslims are not always in agreement with each other, was barred from running in the 2017 presidential elections. The choices of voters and politicians are heavily influenced and ultimately circumscribed by Iran's unelected state institutions and ruling clerical establishment. Women, predictably, given the country's conservative male dominated Muslim culture, remain significantly underrepresented in politics and government. In 2017, the re elected President Rouhani appointed two women among his several vice presidents, but failed to name any women as cabinet ministers. And as already mentioned, all the female candidates for president are disqualified. In June 2019, lawmaker Parvaneh Salashuri complained that she and other women in the parliament or Majlis had to contend with resistance from their male colleagues. She stated that the men often dismiss their proposals, prevent them from taking senior positions, and discourage them from speaking out. So the recognized non-Muslim minorities include the religious minorities include Jews, Armenian Christians, Assyrian and Chaldean Christians, and Zoroastrians. However, they can only practice their own religions privately. If they try to convert the Iranian Muslims, they get into legal trouble. And their 5 representatives in the Majlis have to be vetted or considered worthy of running by the Guardian Council, or the Assembly of Experts, rather. However, ethnic and especially religious minorities are rarely awarded senior government posts, and their political representation remains weak. The elected president's powers are limited by the supreme leader and other unelected authorities. The powers of the elected parliament are similarly restricted by the supreme leader and the unelected Guardian Council, which, as I stated, must approve all bills before they can become law. The parliament has been a platform, nevertheless, for heated political debate and criticism of the government, and legislators have frequently challenged presidents and their policies. However, presidents, not the supreme leaders, apparently. Corruption remains common at all levels of the bureaucracy, despite regular calls by authorities to tackle the problem. Powerful actors involved in the economy, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Bonyads endowed foundations, are above scrutiny, and restrictions on the mass media and civil society activists prevent them from serving as independent watchdogs to ensure transparency and accountability. In 2019, the Iranian courts launched a crackdown on corruption amid accusations that the effort was politically motivated. The transparency of Iran's political system remains extremely limited in practice, and powerful elements of the state and society are not accountable to the public. No wonder there's so much corruption. Freedom of expression and media independence are severely limited both online and offline. The state broadcasting company is tightly controlled by hardliners and influenced by the security apparatus. Newspapers and magazines face censorship and warnings from authorities about which topics to cover and how. Reporters Without Borders said in early December 2019 that at least 11 journalists, including photographers and cameramen, had been arrested since the start of the protests in mid-November. One journalist, Mr. Mohammad Mossad, was arrested that month for tweeting about the internet shutdown. He was released, however, on bail in December. So Iran is home to a majority Shiite Muslim population and Sunni, Baha'i, Christian, and Zoroastrian minorities. The Iranian constitution, however, recognizes only Zoroastrians, Jews, and certain Christian communities as religious minorities. But their freedom to exercise their religions basically means just keeping their religions to themselves. They can't openly promote their religions because that's considered proselytism and is forbidden by the Sharia law. The regime cracks down even on Muslims who are considered to be at variance with the state ideology and interpretation of Islam. Sunni Muslims, who form the country's largest religious minority, complain that they have been prevented from building mosques or Islamic houses of worship in major cities and face difficulty obtaining government jobs. In recent years, there has been increased pressure on the mystical and contemplative Sufi Muslim order Nematollahi Gonabadi, including destruction of its places of worship and the jailing of some of its members. The Baha'is, who accept and combine all major religions, are systematically persecuted, sentenced to prison, and banned from access to higher education. There's an ongoing crackdown on Christian converts, whose number, however, is gradually rising. In the past several years, a number of informal house churches have been raided and their pastors or congregants detained. Academic freedom remains limited in Iran, and universities have experienced harsh repression since 2009. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has warned that universities should not be turned into centers for political activities. Foreign scholars visiting Iran are vulnerable to detention on trumped-up or made-up charges. Shiyue Wang, a U.S. citizen pursuing a doctorate in history who had been jailed from Iran for 3 years on espionage charges, was released in a prisoner exchange in December 2019. Several other academics remained behind bars at the end of 2019, including Iranian-French anthropologist Fariba Adelkha, who had been arrested in June 2019, and Kylie Moore-Gilbert, a British-Australian researcher detained in September 2018. Iran's vaguely defined restrictions on speech, harsh criminal penalties, and state monitoring of online communications are among several factors that deter citizens from exchanging opinions and views in open and free private discussion. Many do, however, risk imprisonment by expressing dissent on social media, in some cases circumventing official blocks on certain platforms. The Constitution states that public demonstrations may be held if they are not detrimental to the fundamental principles of Islam. In practice, only state-sanctioned demonstrations are typically allowed. Non-governmental organizations that seek to address human rights violations are generally suppressed by the state. Iran does not permit the creation of labor unions, only state-sponsored labor councils are allowed. While the Iranian courts have a degree of autonomy or self-government within the ruling establishment, the judicial system is regularly used as a tool to silence regime critics and opposition members. The authorities routinely violate basic due process standards, particularly in politically sensitive cases. Activists are arrested without warrants or official legal permits, held indefinitely without formal charges, and denied access to legal counsel or any contact with the outside world. Former detainees have reported being beaten during arrest and subjected to torture until they confess to crimes dictated by their interrogators. Iran has generally been second only to China in the number of executions it carries out each year. Convicts can be executed for offenses other than murder, such as drug trafficking, for crimes they committed when they were younger than 18 years old. The country faces a long-term threat from terrorist and insurgent groups that recruit from disadvantaged Kurdish, Arab, and Sunni Muslim minority populations. Women do not receive equal treatment even under the law, and they face widespread discrimination in practice. For example, a woman's testimony in court is given half the weight of a man's, and the monetary compensation awarded to a female victim's family upon her death is half that owed to the family of a male victim. Ethnic minorities complain of various forms of discrimination, including restrictions on the use of their languages. And since Iran remains a conservative and fundamentalist Muslim country, predictably, the sexual minorities are severely harassed and discriminated against. The Penal Code criminalizes all sexual relations outside of traditional marriage, and Iran is among the few countries where individuals can be put to death even if they consent to same sex conduct. In other words, neither partner forces the other to have same sex intimate contact. Freedom of movement is restricted, particularly for women and perceived opponents of the regime. Many journalists and activists have been prevented from leaving Iran. In October 2019, under pressure from the world's soccer governing body, the authorities at last allowed women to enter a stadium to attend a male soccer match in Tehran, the capital. Iranians have the legal right to own property and establish private businesses, but powerful institutions like the IRGC play a dominant role in the economy, and bribery is said to be widespread in the business environment, including for registration and obtaining licenses. Women are denied equal rights in inheritance matters. Social freedoms are restricted in Iran. All residents, but especially women, are subject to obligatory rules on dress and personal appearance, and those who are considered to have violated the rules face state harassment, fines, and arrest. In 2019, several Iranian women were sentenced to heavy prison terms for challenging the requirement that they wear headscarves in public. Police conduct raids on private gatherings that breach rules against drinking alcohol and mixing with unrelated members of the opposite sex. Women do not enjoy equal rights in divorce and child custody disputes. In October 2019, the Guardian Council approved a legal amendment, however, that would enable Iranian women married to foreign men to request Iranian citizenship for their children. The government provides no protection to women and children forced into sex trafficking, and both Iranians and migrant workers from countries like Afghanistan are subject to forced labor and debt bondage. So a very sad report, and hopefully the situation will soon start to improve by the good Lord's grace even in Iran.